Hello, everybody. My name is Olivia Mattis. I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program. Today is about the really wonderful, inspirational story of Nicholas Winton, who lived a very long life. He lived to be 105, but early in his life, he did a remarkable thing when he was still a man in his late 20s. So today's program is part of a series of programs that we're showing every Sunday to give people stories of hope, beautiful stories of hope during this time. The Sousa Mendes Foundation is devoted to a rescuer named Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux, France in June of 1940. 80 years ago. And so this month we are marking the 80th anniversary of Sousa Mendes's incredible action of rescuing an estimated 30,000 strangers and really paying a very heavy price. Now, the Sousa Mendes Foundation was started 10 years ago. So we like marking anniversaries, and we had all kinds of things planned for this 80th anniversary. We had an exhibition planned, we had a film premiere planned, we had a gala, we had a trip called Journey on the Road to Freedom through France, Spain, and Portugal. And we had to cancel everything because of COVID. So instead, we're offering these programs, and I do hope that you will join us regularly on these Sundays to come. So now let me tell you a little bit about our upcoming programs before I introduce today's speakers. So next week is Father's Day. And we're having a very special Father's Day program. It's a daughter's love letter to her father in the form of a really amazing genealogical detective project that she did. Her name is Dr. André Lotte. She's a professor of French literature at the University of Montreal. And her father died when she was only 5 years old. She was raised by her French-Canadian mother. And her father was born in Poland, but she really knew nothing about him or his history. And it was only after her mother died and she happened upon a suitcase in her mother's basement that her father's whole history opened up, and she learned about family secrets, and she learned about this very heavy Holocaust history that involved also the beautiful story of Sousa Mendes that she's also connected to. So that's next Sunday, and I encourage everybody to sign up. It's a free program. The Sunday afterwards, which is June 28th, we're having another very special program. It's called The Power of Music. And for that program, we are highlighting the story of Alice Hertz Sommer, who was a concert pianist, and she was also she was a Holocaust survivor, and she was the oldest Holocaust survivor. At the time of her death, she was 110 years old. So there's this film that was made about her called The Lady in Number 6 that shows how music played such an essential role in her survival and also in her ability psychologically to step out of the here and now and take herself to a beautiful, better place. So we thought at the Sousa Mendes Foundation that here we're stuck, we're in confinement, even if things are starting to open, we still have a lot of loss, and music can still function in the same way of taking us out of the here and now. So it's going to be this very special program that involves seeing the film together. We're all going to watch it together. And that is going to be immediately followed by a musical concert in response to the film. So now it's my pleasure to turn my attention to today's speakers and to introduce them. So both of our speakers are pioneers in their field. Eva Fogelman wrote this book, Conscience and Courage, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. And she's really the world's expert on the altruistic personality. She was one of the first people to write about the psychology of rescue during the Holocaust. Annette Insdorf is also a pioneer in her field. She is a film scholar, professor at Columbia University, and she was one of the first people to look at the Holocaust as it's depicted through film. So today we're looking at the film aspect of the story, and we're looking at the psychological dimension, which is a little different from what we've done in other programs that have been more historical. So let's start with Dr. Fogelman. Why don't you start us off?
Well, I think the first question that comes to mind has to do with why did people not know that, and why did his wife not know that here he saved 669 children. And I think that is not very unusual for rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. When most of the rescuers felt that if they began to talk about what it was they did, they would be bragging about having been heroes. They don't think of themselves as having been heroes. They think of themselves as having done the right thing. And this is something important to keep in mind, because all of a sudden, how could it be he didn't even share this with his wife, and it was his wife who found the scrapbook that then led to the whole finding of what exactly had happened. The other thing that's very interesting here is that his wife takes the book to Elizabeth Maxwell. And we have to remember who Elizabeth Maxwell was in 1988, because she's very instrumental as to why this really became a tremendous search for these individuals. So Elizabeth Maxwell was a devout Christian, French. She had a PhD in French literature, and she was married to Robert Maxwell. And in 1988, Elizabeth Maxwell organized the first conference for Holocaust scholars that took place in Oxford University, so that you can see this sort of a confluence. So it would have been very natural for Mrs. Winton to have gone to Elizabeth Maxwell, because Elizabeth Maxwell became sort of the person in England at that time who brought out the Holocaust in that society. I would say till 1988, there was not very much discussion about the Holocaust in England, and it was through Elizabeth Maxwell. And so it's very interesting that she now becomes the conduit for finding all these children that Nicholas Winton had saved. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of history to see how he fits, how Nicholas Winton fits in, and also a little bit about who he was as individual. So Winton was born in 1909 in London. He's the oldest child of 3 children. His parents were Jewish, and they came from Germany, and they had converted to Christianity, and they also baptized Nicholas Winton. They, by the way, changed their name. His father's name was Nicholas George Wertheimer, and he changed it to Winton. Now, you may think this is very unusual for a Jew to become a Christian. I will tell you that in Germany around the turn of the century, it was not very unusual for Jews to convert to Christianity, particularly since the father was a banker, and it would have been very difficult as a Jew to operate in that world as a banker. Winton grew up very privileged. they lived in a 20-room mansion. And but what is interesting, I tried to get information about, you know, his mother, his father, which I couldn't get much information of. But what I did find is that he was involved in communist activities and socialist activities, so that you can see that he already was an individual who was concerned about the well-being of others and also the well-being of society, even though, and, you know, he himself went into banking. He worked in several countries. He worked in Germany, he worked in France, and then he went into, in 1931, he went into becoming a stockbroker in England. So now let's take a look at what is happening in the world, okay? And that will lead us into why Winston got involved in the rescue activity. One thing, by the way, is that one never really asks the rescuer, why did you do what you did? They don't really, you know, it's so much a part of, you know, who they are as a person that, you know, it's not something that they, you know, they thought about their motivation of what it is. So as a psychologist, what I try to do is I try to look at the sequential narrative of the individual's life, and also what is happening historically at the time, and then what is that particular moment that led to begin the rescue activity. And here and there we see people asking him why, you know, why he wanted to get involved. So
Dr. Fogelman, maybe now would be a good time to bring in Professor Insdorf just to say a little bit about the film, and then we can come back.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, especially in the company of my friend, EVA FOGELMAN, who I've known for many, many years and whose work I appreciate a great deal.
Likewise, Annette.
I think we all know that Holocaust films associate trains with death. In Nicky's family, we finally see a train bound for life, the transport from Czechoslovakia to Liverpool. And how wonderful is it to see those now aged survivors taking a memorial train together again in September 9th. That was September 09, which was 70 years later when Winton was 100. We also get to see an aged foster mother in the present after we hear a survivor quote her wonderful first words to a child, "You shall be loved." The film's visual richness includes a photo in an album at the beginning, becoming archival footage of 1930s Prague. And remember that touching moment later in the archival footage of someone's hand approaching a bonfire and then gently rubbing a child's shoeless foot for warmth. The shot of a sculpture dedicated to the 250 rescued children who arrived at Liverpool station is moving too, especially because the survivor Ben Abeles touches it. This kaleidoscopic film, Nicky's Family, juxtaposes many stories via voiceover, interviews, and archival footage. I should mention that it also includes what the opening calls free dramatization of real events. I confess that this is something that troubles me in most documentaries. I have problems with reenactments, especially when they are accompanied by intrusive music, as when an actor playing Winton is in a program. The interviews and archival footage of Nicky's Family are more than enough to tell Winton's tale, which is narrated by Joe Schlesinger, a Canadian TV journalist who was one of the rescued children. He and his brother were among the more than 200 kids who traveled under guard by train through Nazi Germany. This was in June of 1939 on Winton's Kindertransport, and Schlesinger's parents were killed in the Holocaust. As you saw, many scenes in the film are of him or Winton speaking to students, something so important. While many of the rescued children are now adults in Israel with impressive positions, it's curious that one is a pastor. And I, for one, would like to know more about how he became a Christian reverend. But as Eva Fogelman pointed out, Winton, born Nicholas Wertheim, his Jewish ancestry, I mean, it disqualified him from being declared a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. And when he died in July of 2015, I believe he was actually 106, that was exactly 76 years from the day that a transport of 241 of his children left from Prague. And perhaps the parents in Czechoslovakia were more sensitive to the impending danger, more ready to let their children go because the Sudetenland was already occupied by Germany. For me, the most moving part of Nicky's family is the last 20 minutes, using footage from the 1988 TV broadcast that revealed his heretofore unknown feats. The BBC program That's a Life managed to bring the children he saved, as well as their children, into the audience, where Winton got to see the ripened fruits of his labor. After being reunited on camera with many of the adults whose lives he saved 50 years earlier, he became the subject of so much public acclaim, including the knighthood. More importantly, he inspired young people around the world to do seemingly impossible good deeds, including helping children in Africa and Cambodia. What a superb image in this movie of kids waving their lit cell phones in a dark theater in the presence of the seated 100-year-old Winton in answer to whether anyone there has done a good deed. It's not just paying it forward, but outward, as when a survivor mentions the ripple effects of Winton's actions. Because he rescued 669, of which 261 were identified at the time of filming, 5,700 were alive in 2011, even more today. I appreciate the film's inclusion of other heroes, like Elie Wiesel, who seems to be endorsing Winton, and the Dalai Lama, who says that we must carry Winton's spirit forward. When we saw this film years ago, my husband Mark said that in this century, the internet has spread out information, adding, like Winton's letters did in 1938. And Mark heard on radio NPR's On Being about a Ms. Monk telling of how the title of her music was accidentally changed on a CD label from scared music to sacred music. I found this relevant to a story of scared children becoming a tale of sacred rescue. The director, Matej Minac, who is a 58-year-old Slovak filmmaker, he actually made a trilogy of films about Winton. All My Loved Ones in 1999 was a fiction film in which the British actor Rupert Graves played Winton. Then came the documentary Nicholas Winton, The Power of Good, which won an Emmy Award for 2002. And finally, Nicky's Family in 2011. After this film, he made another TV documentary in 2016 entitled Children Saved from the Nazis, the story of Sir Nicholas Winton. His movies include a documentary about his mother, photographer Zuzana Minachova, Through the Eyes of the Photographer from 2015. Now, according to one article I read, his mother was one of the children rescued by Nicholas Winton, but I could not find corroboration in any other interview or article, so I'm not sure of it. Among those that Winton saved, however, was the filmmaker Karel Reiss. He then fought as a pilot with the Czech squadron in the RAF during World War II. Later, he became part of the British New Wave and went on to direct The Gambler with James Caan in 1974, Who'll Stop the Rain with Nick Nolte in 78, and The French Lieutenant's Woman with Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons in 81. Finally, when Nicky's Family was released, over 200,000 signatures had been collected for a petition to award Winton the Nobel Prize for Peace. More importantly, thousands of children in many countries decided to follow in his footsteps. There were initiatives for charity projects, including the saving of undernourished and sick children in Africa and Cambodia. And I want to mention a tribute that is at least partly inspired by this film that we have seen. In May 2016, the British military charity Glen Art presented a memorial concert celebrating Winton's life with actors Rupert Graves and Jason Isaacs. All funds donated were given to charities supporting Syrian refugee children.
Wow.
Now, partly because Conscience and Courage is a required textbook in my Columbia University class on Holocaust cinema, I want to give the discussion back to Dr. Fogelman.
Thank you, Annette. Whatever you say is always so illuminating and just so poignant. And your vision of films is, you know, we need more eyes like Annette Insdorf and about looking at cinema. So thank you. I just wanted to answer in terms of the man who became a minister. We have to remember that many of these children were very young. We even had, you know, one that was just a couple of months old and 2-year-old. So they had no experience of being Jewish at all. These families took them in. Most of the families were Christian families, and most of their parents were killed during the Holocaust, never came back for them. So these families adopted them, and that's why, you know, this particular person grew up as a Christian. And unfortunately, out of the 669 children, there are probably others that are Christians today. The other thing about the filmmaker, Matej Minac, of course, I'm not sure, but from what I was reading, I get the feeling that he was asked by one of the children who was rescued to make a film about her. And that's how he learned about the whole story, and rather than his own mother. But, you know, I guess we'll have to ask maybe one of Nicholas Winter's children. So what I'd like to do now is just put into context of how is it that Nicholas Winton got involved in this rescue activity, and how that fits into what was going on in terms of, you know, the making of a rescuer. So we have to go back to, we have the Munich Pact, where Hitler says to England and France that he wants to capture the part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, that is on the border of Germany, where there are many Germans that are living in the section of Moravia and Bohemia. And this happened September 29th to the 30th. And believe it or not, on October 1, 1938, he already is invading them. And we have 150,000, mainly Jews, some other people as well, that are then put into camps. And these camps, you have to remember that here we are, we're talking about October. We now have November, December. Obviously it gets very cold in Egypt. There was a shortage of food and supplies and medical supplies and everything else. So this is October 1, 38. And then we have November 9th, 10th, when Hitler continues. And then we have Kristallnacht that happens in Germany and Austria, where we have about 29,000 Jewish males that are incarcerated. And I don't have to tell you the rest about Kristallnacht in this audience. And then we have Christmas coming up of December of 1938. And Nicholas at that point is a 29-year-old, very successful stockbroker, and he was going to go skiing he, by the way, was quite an athlete. He was into fencing, he was into boating and skiing, and so he was going to go boating. He was going to go skiing with his friend in Switzerland. As he's packing, his friend says to him, "We have a terrible situation here. Instead of going skiing, please come and help me." So we have to remember that the whole idea of the Kindertransport, of helping children, was already beginning to happen right after Kristallnacht in Austria and in Germany. And so when So when Winton meets his friend Martin Blake, he says the first thing you have to do is you have to go see this camp. And so Winton sees the terrible condition that these individuals are coming from. So what I call that is we now have a transforming moment that he has, that these people are going to die. And also, he also had a feeling that, yes, Hitler took, the borders of Sudetenland, and next he's going to go to Prague. And that is confirmed to him because his friend also shows him a map that Hitler had drawn, where he's basically trying to take over all of Europe. So you have more than one transforming moment. First, you have the suffering that he's seeing, and then he also sees the map. The other thing that was happening is that because of the House of Commons in England, right after Kristallnacht, decided that they were going to take in refugees. They were going to take in children who were under the age of 17. So we already have some mechanisms that are set up. So Winston begins by sending all these letters all over, and of course nobody wants to take in any of these refugees, and England is the only one that wants to do that. He obviously then has another transforming movement of, as you saw, all of a sudden, all these parents who are coming and saying, save my child. And this is where you see an individual, this is where his personality comes in. He clearly was somebody who was had tremendous sense of agency. He was obviously very, very competent. And, by writing these letters, he calls his boss and says, I want to do this. The boss obviously is into money and says, come right back home. So what does he do? He goes to England, and right away he enlists his mother to help him out, and they set up a quasi office to try to do this. And he needed three things. He needed 50 pounds for each child, and he needed to find a home to find them. His mother was very much involved in helping him find homes for these children, and as you saw in the movie, they put up all kinds of identifications in the in newspapers and stuff to find. And here he is, he's working all day long as a stockbroker, and at night, he probably never slept. And at night, he continues to be involved in his rescue activity. So in essence, you can see that rescuing became a total occupation. Obviously, he had to go back to Czechoslovakia quite a few times. I think he had about 8 transports of the children, and unfortunately, the last transport was not able to make it on September 1, 1939, because the war had broken out. And what's interesting is that the reunion that takes place in 2009 is symbolically, and it takes place on September 1 of 2009 in a way to commemorate those child survivors who unfortunately did not make it. So when you think about, so obviously it's unfortunate that this individual cannot get recognized by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is Israel's Holocaust memorial and archive for the remembrance of both the victims and the resistors of the Holocaust. And the criteria is obviously the person had to be Jewish, the person had to have risked his life.
Not Jewish.
Yes.
Not Jewish.
Yeah, I said not Jewish.
Not Jewish, yeah.
Yeah, the person had to be not Jewish. The person had to have risked his or her life, and the person did not have to do it for any monetary or other kind of reward. And sometimes, obviously, the situations get a little bit, thorny, particularly when it came to the rescue of children. Some people rescue children, and then wanted to then not give them back to their parents. That's, you know, or sometimes rescue began by getting money and then kept the individuals without money. And so all kinds of, you know, so these relationships become complicated, and that's why Yad Vashem has a committee to sort out some of these. But there is now a movement towards also recognizing Jews who rescued other Jews, and I hope that he somehow gets some kind of recognition by the state of Israel, in addition to all the other recognitions that he got. Now, what is also interesting about Winston is that you can see that his personality continues throughout his life. And by that, I mean that, you know, having been involved in socialist communist activities, he must have been also involved in some kind of altruistic activities early on. What we don't know is, again, the family was quite well-to-do. Were they involved in altruistic activities, and then altruism and helping others became a habit as a result of who he grew up with? But we do see that after his, by the way, during the war, he begins out being a conscientious objector, and then he decides to join the Air Force. So again, you see somebody who wants to do something, who wants to make a difference. And after the war, he goes into international banking for the reconstruction of Europe. And he then also, because he had the financial capabilities, but also the heart, he had a couple of incidents in his life. He lost his 6-year-old son to an illness, and he has a foundation that helps those children. He also set up a home for individuals who have emotional problems, and later on in life, he set up a home for individuals suffering from Alzheimer's, and also a home for seniors. So that you can see that it wasn't just, so that the Holocaust for him was not just a one-time incident of helping. This was part of his personality that carried him throughout his life. One of the things that I always say to the rescuers who were reluctant to speak is that you're not speaking because you want to brag about it, but rather because you become a role model for what is possible for people to make a difference in this society. And, you know, we're living in a kind of society where altruism, goodness is not something that is promoted. What's promoted is, you know, the football stars and the basketball stars and the actors and the actresses and the super rich. And so it is so wonderful to have the fact that that Winston finally did speak and is having an influence on the world that is so important for us. And that's why whenever I met a rescuer, I was involved in setting up a foundation for Christian rescuers, which today is the Foundation for the Righteous, to get these individuals to speak up and to go to school so that young people, one is have a sense of hope about the future and what is possible and what it is that they can do to make a difference in their own societies.
Professor Insdorf, is there something you would like to add?
I guess the only part I would add is personal, because my father was saved by Polish peasants in the woods during World War II. In fact, I very often have my backdrop corresponding to whatever I'm doing on Zoom. So in addition to my mother, Cecile Insdorf, who survived Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and had the worst of it, my father, Michael Insdorf, initially he and his 2 brothers were taken in by a Christian family because that family was being paid. My father was always very clear about the fact that altruism was not an initial factor. They were getting money. But of course, no one knew how long the war would go on. And ultimately, they not only kept my father, his 2 brothers, they risked their lives to keep them. So at a certain point, the mercantile or commercial possibility yielded to something else. And I have, for many, many years of my adult life, been ruminating this whole question of what is it that makes one person, whether a Polish peasant or a German Christian neighbor, what is it that makes one person complicit and indifferent when it comes to the regime and those being victimized?
They're all different.
And what makes somebody take an incredible risk because it's the right thing to do? And I question my students about this, asking each of us, including myself, to reflect on how many of us would be willing to take the kind of risk that Winton and others did. What would it take? And would we be doing it primarily because of some altruistic, whether genetic or conditioned thing? Deep down, I have come to a realization about myself that I'm not proud of, but I'll share it for what it's worth. A lot of the charity I give, or the altruistic, the good deeds that I do, they are connected to my self-image, to the image of myself that I want to live by and have out there. So I sometimes ask my students the question I ask myself. If your altruism, if your good deed is partly because you need to look at yourself in the mirror and see something that shines, is it any less altruistic than if you merely did it because you want to help another? So these are the questions I raise as opposed to any answers I can offer.
Wonderful.
That's beautiful.
So I do see the questions are starting to come into the chat window, which is nice. So I would like to encourage.
I just want to add just one thing. When we talk about the rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, when we talk about the Christians, what we are talking, I mean, whatever, I wrote a whole book about that, but I would say that the most important thing was a tolerance and acceptance of people who were different, for those who were Christians, and
Not
that
everybody.
individuals were able to see the Jews as human beings just like themselves, and not go along with all the Nazi propaganda that the Jews were vermin, that the Jews created all the economic ills of the society, that the Jews spread all the diseases because they don't wash themselves. And this is something that they learned at home. And that's why I think what one teaches their children is the most important thing. And also these individuals had parents or grandparents or some role model that they saw helping other people. We have to remember that many of these rescuers during the Holocaust were children during World War I. Some of them had losses and somebody came and took care of them. Or they were involved in helping in the community, like working in the soup kitchens because all the men were away, or helping a woman who's pregnant because her husband was out. So that they had a role model of altruism, again, that also, you know, once they were in a situation to help, then they, you know, it was a part of who they are. And obviously you need the situation, which is what Winton had, to get involved in the rescue activity.
Okay, so I see that questions are continuing to come into the chat window, which is wonderful. So I do encourage everyone who has a question to start typing it in, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce a surprise third panelist, and that is Mrs. Hannah Sloan. So Hannah Sloan, when she was 14 years old, was herself rescued by Nicholas Winton, and she took one of those trains. So Mrs. Sloan, why don't you introduce yourself and say a few words?
Very gladly. I'd like to answer a few questions that just came up. Number one, Nicky Winton did not speak Czech. Number two, how did Matej Minac come across the story? Vera Gissing was one of the children that was saved. And when she left with her sister, and she said, Mommy, how am I going to manage? She said, look, every day you write a note. You write a note on a little piece of paper and tell me what the day was like. I will look at the sun and I will look at the moon. I see the same sun and the same moon that you see. and just write it and I will know. At the end of the whole thing, she had a whole pile of these little slips. Her parents did not survive, and she wrote a book, Pearls of My Childhood. Matej Minac came across that book, and he started doing research. And it took him about 2 years. And when he had the research, he made 3 films. And that's how we know about it. And thanks to Matej, it's really all that Winton, Nicky got all that with the fame, because I'm sure there are many other people who did similar things, but so the films helped. This is the one thing. And something else came up. I always see all the questions here. You want a list, or somebody wanted a list of all the children. There is a list, and I'm sure it's very easy to get either you get in contact with Matej Minac, I'm sure he has it, and if not, there's a Czech group in London that I'm in touch with from my hometown. I'm sure they have it. So if anybody is looking as to who saved them, I did not know myself who saved me. It was just by chance. And how did I find out? I was with somebody and they were talking about Nicholas Winton saving them. I said, how do you know? She said, look up the list. And there I was on the list. So that was some of the questions that came up. I went out, I had just turned 14, and my father, my brother was 3 years older. And my brother, he said, I don't want you here because I feel there's going to be a war. You can't settle these things. I want you out of here. So he got him a job in New York at the World's Fair as a baker or something. And so my brother at 17 said, look, I'm Jewish. I don't want to be on the train all by myself. Come with me to the Dutch border. And this is what they had planned. That was the day we were invaded. March 15th, 1939. They made it through, my father was not prepared to leave the country. They just went on and had no problem getting across the border. They got to England and they went as the refugees. I had an uncle there who was an astronomer, and he gave the 50 pounds guarantee for us later on, so that we don't become a burden to the British nation. What it was 50 pounds just in case we needed something really special or medical care to cover that cost. That's how you got in. To become a British citizen was not so easy. We were British subjects, but never a citizen. In America, you could become a citizen. So my father tried very hard to get me to America. He had a brother who used to live in Hamburg, and he settled there, and he asked my brother to give me an affidavit. The affidavit came in November 1944. We were still at war, and I took a convoy of a lot of ships. I was in the little, at night, it would be, we all would stop the engines and just sit still. In the morning, we all had to get together. It was quite a tour. And I arrived in Canada, and from Canada, I took the train to New York. And at that point, I was 19 years old. And at 19, I had very little schooling, but I also want to say that I was not the best student. I hated studying. But I tried to go to Jamaica High and get my diploma, and I failed American history and algebra. And then I decided to look for a husband. I said that was, I worked as a stenographer, sort of stenographer. I picked up the language. I'm good at picking up, but I don't read much. So I was a girl Friday. I met my husband through a friend of my father's. My father was the chairman of the Maccabi. And every Easter and Christmas, we would go skiing in the High Tatras in the Slovakia. And we would get a whole hotel, and we were about 90 people, mostly youngsters. And we spent, and so when I came here, he said to me, I had been friendly with them. and he had met my husband. He got a job, something with tires, I don't know, downtown. And anytime he saw a refugee, he said, do you want to come for a Friday night dinner to my house? Who wouldn't in those days? What was the dinner? A potato soup. And it kept on getting more and more. I mean, whatever he had mushrooms, something, she threw it all into the soup. We didn't care. We would sing songs. He sang very well. And this was the beginning. And I met my husband there. But my husband didn't want to have a poor girl. So a refugee, he was trying to get somebody that they could start fresh. So he befriended a Belgian girl whose father was in the diamond business. And when he proposed, in those days, you had to ask for the father's permission. He asked for the father's permission. He didn't get it. You have to come and work for me. When you finish the army, he was then in the American army. When you finish the army, you have nothing. So my husband promised he would work very hard. But Rosita also went with her father. And the next day, he calls me up, and this is like 3 years that we've been in touch with each other, and we had a date, and we got married about, I think, just a couple of weeks later. And
Mrs. Sloan, we have about 10 minutes left. I know that Professor Insdorf has a hard cutoff at 5. So I'm just wondering, very briefly, can you talk about what Nicholas Winton means to you?
What he means to me in my life. I'm now 95 years old. And tears come to my eyes because without him, I would not have had this experience. I've lived nearly 100 years and things are completely changed. And Nicky, I knew Nicky, I went to see him. He was Nicky to us. He was just part of us. And by the way, if you sent him anything, he saved everything. I went to him, all the knickknacks and everything. He had a whole collection of things and he would make little tapestry. Nicky, I just ask that anybody, and I have a horrible feeling that things repeat themselves in history. If you have the chance to save anybody, and don't worry about how good or whatever you are, every life is so important. I have such pleasure. I want to tell you, I have 2 children, and I have now 5 great-grandchildren, and we are all doing well. And half of them, the problem is I can't move. I'm living in this house here for 60 years. It's falling apart. My son is in California. My daughter is in Israel. A dream my father had the whole time that we should go to Israel. So my daughter lives there and is very happy. And it's hard. I don't know. I don't know if I would have had the strength that he had, because the beginning was very hard. And I'm sure his mother helped me a lot to change places, because I was more, after I finished school at 14 in England, I was more like a maid. And you know, I wasn't brought up as a maid. So I'm sure I complained a lot as a teenager, but I made it. And I am so grateful for him. And I tell any youngster who sees dilemma, don't complain. There is a hope. You can do so much in your life.
Wonderful. So let's get to a couple of questions, and then I guess we're going to get to some final thoughts of our speakers. So one is, were there any Jewish families in England that took in the children, or were they all non-Jewish families?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
All right. The story was this. I never lived with a Jewish family. People who did live with Jewish families said, oh, are you lucky? What happens is, in those days, most of the Jewish families who took children in were Orthodox. I was not brought up Orthodox. I'm just conservative. And they were then, Orthodoxy is very strict, very strict. And I lived with Quakers who were just wonderful. If we had one egg, we shared it all. If we had whatever we had, I was there during the war, lived with them. I cannot say enough for the people that helped me, or where I lived. And I don't remember whether I had a job then. My jobs were never much, but I have nothing but respect. And by the way, 21 days on a ship with the English crew. I'm 19. Not one time did anybody get fresh with me or try anything.
That's great. Okay, so let's get to a couple of more questions. So there was Nicholas Winton's friend who had originally invited him on the ski trip.
Right.
So the question is, was this friend also involved in any way in the rescue action?
Yes, he was rescuing the politically involved people, like the writers that would be imprisoned right away. So he was trying to get them out. That was his job. And he said, look, while I'm doing this, there were some famous names among them. Why don't you go to that camp and see those refugees? And that's how the whole story started.
Wonderful. So I also wanted to acknowledge that there are a number of other people aside from yourself, Mrs. Slum, who are on this Zoom call who have personal connections to the Winton story. We have a couple of other direct Winton children, and we have several second-generation people on this call, including the daughter of the central character and narrator, Joseph Schlesinger. So now I would like to turn back to Professor Insdorf and Dr. Fogelman and ask if you have some final thoughts in these 5 minutes we have left.
Well, speaking personally, the only thought I can possibly have at this moment is to acknowledge that having Hannah Sloan as part of this experience is worth even more than watching the excellent movie that brought us together for today. When I think of someone who's made it to 95, kol kavod, that you are with us and so articulate and with such a good memory. You are the living tribute, as well as some of the others who are joining us today who were either saved or their progeny. These are the living tributes to the goodness that
I remember the old things. I don't remember where I put my glasses 2 minutes ago.
We're all starting to get there sooner or later, but I'm just very grateful for your participation.
I do. Thank you. I spoke when I was covered the whole East Coast, speaking about my life after Nicky was here that time when he came to visit, and so I spoke for most of UJA and all, and I spoke in colleges, but the students in colleges don't come. In high school, I now spend about 4 or 5 years at the Weizmann Institute once a month speaking, and it was very much appreciated. It was a lot of Black children, and they felt that they had also a horrible background history, and suddenly they stopped. They said they were not interested in the Holocaust. So I think it does give support to the youngsters to tell them that even somebody who was brought up with money, or even somebody who was that, it can still happen to you.
And I'm sure that I speak for many of us in adding that perhaps altruism has never been in greater need since World War II than it is now. I mean, the constant barrage of horrors that are taking place around the world, partly because of COVID-19 and partly because of governmental structures. I mean, this is the particular moment to be not just remembering Nicholas Winton and others who risked a great deal to save those they didn't need.
I just want to say the checks were not all open to us. Believe me, there was plenty of anti-Semitism there, a lot. And maybe that kept us as a Jewish group active and more together. Because you said, yes, I'm sure many opened their homes, and same in England. Many opened, but many didn't want to, didn't they? Said, it's not my business. And that's life, that's people.
Dr. Fogelman, would you like to?
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things. First, I wanted to thank Patty Tenner, who's on the board of directors of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, who connected me with Hannah Sloan and also with Alice Masters. If you remember the film, Alice Masters was the child whose mother had tremendous difficulty deciding whether to keep her with her or whether to put her on the train, and then eventually Alice Masters takes her little child, her little daughter, her little sister, who is 2 years old, and she lives in Washington, D.C. today, and is also in and is also in the 90s. One of the things that is terribly inspiring about this film is the ripple effect that we have of this altruism that we saw among some of the young children. And, you know, we saw the girl who is giving her hair to somebody, cutting her hair to give it to somebody who had cancer and lost their hair because of chemotherapy. We saw the children in Israel where the Israeli children are meeting with Palestinian children. And we have a great organization that the late Leo Charney started of reconciliation, where we have that. So that part of the problem in our culture today is that goodness does not get the same kind of attention in the media as evil does. And I think that many of the children growing up today, all they are exposed to is watching, you know, one film after another that is exposing killing, that has heroes who are killers or who are deceitful in some way. And that's why I think that a film like this really needs to continue to be spread all over the world, so that I think that it will really begin to have the kind of ripple effects that I think that Nicholas would have wanted for himself and for the rest of the world. Because what we see is, we see that he had such an impact on his grandchildren who are continuing in that tradition, and that you know, that helping becomes a habit when we begin it as young children and move on into adulthood. So that I hope that this film really continues to have the wide distribution that it deserves to really make a difference for youngsters today.
So I feel that this hour has just flown by. We've barely scratched the surface of what can be said about Nicholas Winton and his story. I wanted to mention that in our event coming up of June 28th, where we're having the called The Power of Music, where we're featuring Alice Hertz Summer and how music took her out of the here and now, that event is going to be partly to benefit direct refugee assistance. We're partnering with HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and so a portion of the proceeds will go towards refugee assistance. And HIAS used to have their motto, or their reason for being, which was rescuing refugees because they were Jewish. And now, under their new CEO, Mark Hedfield, they have a new motto, which is rescuing refugees because we are Jewish. And that is really a beautiful thing. And we wanted to partner with them. We're partnering with them on 2 events. That's the first of the 2 events. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank both of our speakers, all 3 of our speakers, to thank all of the participants for giving us part of your Sunday. And I do hope you'll join us for the upcoming programs. Have a nice rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, Olivia, for insisting that we show this film to Aristides de Sousa Mendes Foundation. I really appreciate the fact that I had an opportunity to, to think about him and the ripple effects that he has and will continue to have.
Great. Thank you to you and to Professor Insdorf and to Mrs. Sloan. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.